Okay, so we are up to the middle of chapter 22, the finding of Isaac, toward the end, really. I guess page, if you're on the art scroll, I guess it's page 105 or 104 in the Hebrew. So we just want to say a few more points before we continue to the next short section, and then we get to the next parsha, which is the parsha of passing of Sarah, the life of Sarah. So just one interesting sort of semi-halachic point. And you see how like the halachic understanding of the Torah also influences the pshat, the simple meaning. So if you look at the verse, if you look at chapter 22, verse 11. So verse 11 says, and an angel of Hashem called to him from the heaven, and he said, Abraham, and he said, here I am. I'm sorry, I meant verse 12. Verse 12 said, and he said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad, nor do anything to him. For now I know that you are a God-fearing man. So he says, do not do anything to him. So what is the implication? Do not do anything to him. Rashi quotes the Medrash that says that when God says, do not slaughter, verse 12, in verse 12, when the verse says, do not stretch out your hand against the lad, meaning to say, do not slaughter the lad. So Rashi quotes the Medrash that says, so Abraham thinks to himself, so I schlepped all this distance for no reason, because Abraham just traveled 3 days and he thought he's bringing an offering. And then now he's told that he's not bringing an offering. So this whole trip was a waste of gas, or there was no gas, but the waste of time. So he says, you know what, at least I'll make a little bit of a wound and I'll extract some blood. That's what the Medrash says. This is going through Abraham's mind. So therefore, the verse says in verse 12, he says, first of all, he says, don't stretch out your hand against the lad. That implies don't slaughter the lad. And then he says, nor do anything to him. Don't do anything. Don't extract any blood. Don't do anything. And then, so then to Abraham's point, so why am I here? Oh, now he tells us, so why did I step all this distance? So the verse 12 continues, oh, so understand that it's a test, right? Now I know that you are a God-fearing man. So now I know that now I know that you're a God-fearing man. So the point here is that don't do anything means don't even make a little wound, don't extract any blood. That's the interpretation according to the Medrash. And what does this tell you? This tells you that Abraham was almost anxious to serve God in some way, either slaughtering the son. If he can't slaughter, at least do something. And God really has to hold him back. That's the sort of the implication, the feeling you get from the Medrash. But here's an interpretation from the Netziv of Volozhin. So he was in the 19th century, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, he was the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, one of the Rosh Yeshivas in the famed Yeshiva of Volozhin. And he was like, he taught a Chumash class. He taught a class of the Torah, the Bible, in the yeshiva, which was unusual because usually in the yeshiva, they only taught Talmud. So, but this was his thing. He's going to start teaching the Bible as well. And here you see how the legal part of Torah influences this pshat, this simple meaning. So in the legal part of Torah, there's a whole discussion, a whole concept that based on one of the verses, it's a prohibition to make a wound in an animal that is a sacrifice called kadashim. Kadashim is a holy animal. A holy animal, you're not allowed to make a wound in the animal. You can't make a wound, even a slight wound, even a scratch. That's a prohibition because it's complete. It can only be offered to God if it's complete. When you read the third book of the Torah just a few weeks ago, Torah keeps saying tamim. It has to be complete. It has to be a complete animal. And if the animal is not complete, if the animal has any form of a blemish, then it cannot be offered on the temple. Right? There's a whole story in the Talmud about the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of a second temple, that there was the Bar Kamsa and Kamsa, the famous story, the two people that got into a fight. Long story short, when one of them wanted to go and tell the Romans that the Jewish people rebelled against him, what they did is he basically told the Roman emperor, he said, look, if you're going to send an offering to the temple, the Jewish people are going to reject it. That's what he said. That was the claim, because they're rebelling against you. And let's put it to the test. So the emperor sends an offering to the temple. And what this guy does, he makes a little slit. I think it was on the eye, on top of the eye or the lip. I don't remember. It could be there were two versions. I don't remember. I should check this up. Tractate Gittin. In any case, it makes a little slit and makes a little wound within the animal. And the Jewish people, of course, are not going to accept it, because you're not allowed to offer an offering with a blemish. And then this guy goes back to the Romans, and you see the Jewish people did not accept your offering. So this is just a story where this appears. But in the Mishnah, there's so many laws about you're not allowed to actively place a wound in an animal that's a sacrifice. And therefore, there's a whole mechanism. Let's say there's a doubt whether or not you have to bring an offering. If there's a doubt, you cannot offer it, because you cannot bring an animal that's not an offering. You can't bring it to the temple. So if there's a doubt, what do? You can't offer it in the temple. You can't take it home either, because you can't use a holy offering for something that is mundane. So what you have to do is you have to let the animal graze until it will get some scratch naturally. And once it gets that little blemish, it's no longer fit for an offering. If it's no longer fit for an offering, you could take it home. But you can't impose the blemish, because that's a prohibition, right? It has to happen naturally. So all I'm trying to say is a whole thing. You can't, this is a big deal and a big subject. So if you have this knowledge and you read the verse, what do you see from this? God is now. What else do we know before we put all the pieces of the puzzle together? What else do we know? We also know that later Isaac is considered an offering, because Isaac is the only one of the patriarchs that God tells him, do not leave Israel. Abraham left Israel even after he came. He wasn't born in Israel, but he left Israel because of the famine. Jacob was born in Israel, but left Israel many times. First, he ran away to Haran, and then he went to Egypt. So Jacob is running away. Jacob does not live in Israel. Isaac is the only one born in Israel. And then when there was a famine, and he thought he'll do what his father did, and leave because of the famine, God says, no, you can't leave Israel. Why can't you leave Israel? So the Medrash says you can't leave Israel because you are an olat mimah. You are an elevation offering. And just like the elevation offering has to be in the holy space, you have to keep it in the temple or in Jerusalem, depending on the offering. Isaac is considered an offering, and therefore he cannot leave Israel. That's the Medrash. So now we're going to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. Says the Netziv of Volozhin, who, like I said, he was the Rosh Yeshiva, so the head of the yeshiva. We knew his granddaughter, Randy Held, who used to work at Chabad, was his great granddaughter. Her name was Berlin, her maiden name, and his name was Berlin, which later became one branch of the family became Bar Ilan. They made it a little bit more Hebrew, and that's the Bar Ilan University. But that's another story. In any case, so what does he say? If Abraham has in mind to offer his son, to sanctify an offering, the verse says in Leviticus, it has to be lirtzonchem. It has to be to your will. You have to want it, right? If I offer an offering and I say, this will be an elevation offering, but I don't really want to give it, it's not valid, right? That's what the verse says. The verse says, I'm looking at the third book of the Torah, Leviticus, when it introduces the offerings. It keeps saying, lirtzono, for his will. I'm just giving you an example. Leviticus chapter 1, verse 3, I'm just reading. If one's offering is an elevation offering from the cattle, he shall offer an unblemished male. Remember I said unblemished, that was a big deal. He shall bring it to the entrance of a tent of meeting voluntarily. Not the best translation. Lirtzono, to his will. Okay? You have to really want to. If you don't want to, if it's not a genuine desire, it's not considered sanctified. It's not considered an animal that is an offering. And that concept keeps coming up. It keeps saying, lirtzono, to his will, lirtzonchem, to your will. Okay, fine. So God tells Abraham, offer your son as an elevation offering. Hallelu, elevate him. Now, you have to look at Abraham. Did Abraham really want to do this? Did he really want to do God's will? Well, only God knows. Well, we don't know. So let's think of a scenario, halachic scenario. Abraham doesn't do it. He's only doing it because God, quote unquote, coerces him. I have to do it. God told me to do it. I have to do it. I don't really want to do it. If that's the case, Isaac is not sanctified as an offering. If that's the case, you can make a blemish in Isaac. It's no problem. You're not allowed to make a blemish in an offering. But if it's not your will, it's not an offering. If it's not an offering, you can make a blemish. If Abraham really does want to offer his son because that's what God wants, it's his will, it's his desire, then the consequence is Abraham, his son is an offering, is holy, because it's to his will. And if he's holy, then you cannot make a wound you can't make any blemish in an offering. So now let's go back and read verse 12, and you see how the halachic mind reads verse 12. What is verse 12? Verse 12 says, and he said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad. Okay, God doesn't want you to slaughter him, fine. But then he says, nor do anything to him, implying you cannot take out any blood, you can't make any blemish. Like we said, Rashi's interpretation. Why not? This is an indication that Abraham really wanted to do God's will. And that's the continuation of the verse. For now I know that you are a God-fearing man. Now I know that you really want to do what God wants. Right? So here, the idea, when you read the verse, don't do anything. Like I said, from Rashi's perspective, it just means Abraham is anxious to serve God. God has to say, don't do anything. Not only you shouldn't slaughter him, don't even make any blemish, don't extract any blood, because it indicates that Abraham really wants to do something to serve God. But looking from the halachic perspective, this verse, do not do anything, is an indication. It tells us about Abraham's inner state of mind when he's offering the offering. He's not doing it only because he's forced to. He's doing it because he wants to do God's will. His will is present, and therefore, as a result, it's consecrated. Isaac is consecrated, and as a result, he cannot make the blemish. So this verse, do not make a blemish, indicates Abraham's state of mind. So this is how, when you look at the story from the lens of the halacha, then you get that additional insight. I thought that was interesting. Go ahead.
No, the question is,
yes.
Now maybe only in the English, but literally, do not do anything. An implication of passivity. Don't combine him. In other words,
Das loy. Don't do anything to him. Doing it to him means to his body, as opposed to the binding. That's external.
Well, I'm saying so the English is probably a lot less clearer than the Hebrew.
Probably. Let's see verse. How do they translate? Nor do anything to him. Atas loy me'uma. It's okay. I see what you're saying, but I would say tas loy. The reason why Rashi says, look, Rashi says that it means atas be'um. Don't make any blemish in him. That's what Rashi quotes the Medrash in verse 12. So my guess is, because Rashi is reading the verse very literal. If it means do not unbind him, then it's don't do anything to the binding, right? Him means to him. Him means to the body, not even to the garments, to the body, to him. So it means don't do anything to him. So Rashi says it means don't make a blemish. What I'm trying to say is, depending on who's giving the class, that's the interpretation you get. If you have a Rosh Yeshiva making a class on the Chumash, that's the kind of class you get. If you have a Talmud teacher giving this class, you see the Talmudic influence, that this is an indication that it's, like I said, this is an indication that Abraham's intention was complete. Because if Abraham's intention was not complete, then then Isaac is not sanctified. If Isaac is not sanctified, okay, you give a blemish. Everybody gets a blemish, no big deal, right? You can get a scratch, but you can't make a scratch in an offering. No, that would be a violation. So that's the first. Go ahead.
Just to make sure I understand. So meaning, had he made a blemish, that would have made him unable to agree and sacrifice.
Yeah, there's a different, that too, but there's a prohibition against. It's called matil mum b'kadashim. You cannot make a blemish in a holy animal. If I say I'm going to bring this animal to the temple, okay, this animal becomes holy. I have to bring it. If there's a blemish, first of all, if there's a blemish, you can't bring it. It's no longer holy. And therefore it's okay, then I can use it for my own personal needs. If it's now blemish, it's holy, and if I use it for my personal needs, it's a violation. It's one of the 613 prohibitions. Plus is me'ilah, you have to bring an offering, a sin offering, a guilt offering. It's complex. It's a big deal. You can't take something that belongs to the temple, belongs to God, and use it for yourself. So once I sanctify it, I can't use it for myself. If a blemish develops by itself, if there's a blemish in this animal, it's grazing in the field and it gets cut by a twig or whatever, then it's no longer holy, and I could take it home.
Mhm.
And that's why, like I said earlier, if there's a doubt whether or not, let's say there's a doubt whether or not I'm supposed to bring this offering for whatever reason, I'm not sure, whatever the doubt is, you don't know what to do. So the way you deal with an animal that's in doubt in the Talmud, what are you going to do? You can't bring it to the temple, because you cannot bring to the temple an offering that is not holy.
Mhm.
So if I had no obligation to bring a sin offering, I can't bring a sin offering, right? You can't bring a chulin, you can't bring mundane animal into the temple. That's the law. But on the other hand, I can use it for myself. So what am I going to do? So the solution is tira ad she tista'ev. Let it graze until it gets a blemish. Right? So you take the holy animal, say go graze every day. You can let it go work, and that you can't work. You can't use it to plow your field. It's holy. That would be me'ilah. That would be deriving benefit from holy cattle. The point here is, so what you do is you let it naturally graze, and until it gets a scratch. If it gets a scratch, no, it's no longer fit for the temple. You can take it for yourself. The holiness evaporates, so to speak. Okay, but I actively cannot make a mum. I cannot make a blemish. If I could make a blemish in my animal that's not holy. So, having all that information, looking at this verse, we see that God says, don't slaughter him. But God also says, don't do anything to him. Don't make any blemish, because now I know you're God-fearing. And the end of the verse, you did not hold back your son. What does it mean? You didn't want to hold him back. You really wanted to offer him. It had your will. When you brought him here, your will was intact. Your will was complete to do God's will. And therefore, says the Netziv, therefore, because you didn't hold it back, you really wanted to give, therefore he's holy. Therefore he's holy, can't make a blemish. All I'm trying to say is when we read this verse, don't make a blemish means don't make a blemish. But if you have a Talmudic knowledge, don't make a blemish is synonymous with this animal is holy. Right? That's the way. And we also know that, like I said earlier, the Medrash says that Isaac can't leave Israel because he's holy. That's why Abraham and Isaac leave. Isaac cannot leave. But the point here is those words. What does it mean? Don't do anything to him. According to the Medrash, don't make a blemish. If you have a Talmudic background, don't make a blemish means this thing is holy. Says the Netziv, because you didn't hold him back, because you really wanted to offer him, that's why he's holy. If there would be a problem with will, if Abraham was coerced, I have no choice. God told me what to do, so I'm doing it. But I don't really want to do God's will. I'm forced. I'm being schlepped. If I'm being schlepped, then Isaac is not holy. Then my will is not present. Abraham's will is not present. So Isaac is not holy. So God would never say, don't make a blemish. Make a blemish. Don't make a blemish. Doesn't bother me. But if now that we know you didn't hold back your son, which means you really wanted to do God's will, which means your will was complete. But your will was complete. Therefore, now I know that he's holy. And if he's holy, don't make a blemish. All I'm trying to say is that the person learning, giving the interpretation based on their background, that's how the interpretation is going to sound. So when you have a head of a yeshiva giving a class on the Akedah, you're going to get a different type of class. So it's interesting to see how this all plays out. So I thought that was interesting. Yes, Steve.
During Isaac's normal activities after the Akedah, suppose during his normal activities, he cuts his finger.
That's a good question. That's a good question. That's a good question. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. I could say a few things. I could say, number one, I could say if it's on purpose, that would be a problem. Right? If it's by mistake, it's by mistake. But if it's on purpose, that may be a problem. And we see that we have the precedent that Isaac is supposed to treat himself like an offering and live up to the higher standard of holiness. And the only expression that we see in the story is we see that he can't leave Israel. Like I said, that's where the Medrash makes the point clearly, because it's backed up by the story. Because God says, "Don't leave Israel." Why not? Your father left. Your son is going to leave. What's unique about Isaac? So the only thing we can think of, Isaac was on offer. Isaac was an offering. So Isaac has to live with a higher level of spirituality. I would imagine that Isaac cannot actively harm himself. I mean, none of us could harm ourselves. Yeah, that's another step. If it's by mistake, right? Yeah, by mistake is a mistake. If you fell and you tripped while you're playing basketball and you got a bruise, okay, fine. But again, it's not, I don't know if you can apply the halachic definitions, because if he got a bruise, he still would be holy, because he was holy because he still can't leave Israel. So I don't know if we can, it's before the giving of a Torah. I don't know if we could fully impose the halachic definitions on Isaac's full life. But like I said, if you're reading this verse and you know everything the Talmud says and the whole discussion, and for you, do not, a holy animal is synonymous with don't make a blemish. When you read don't make a blemish, what that tells you is this guy is holy. Why is he holy? Because you did not hold back your son. The verse 12. You did not hold back your son means we already know we didn't hold back a son. Why does God have to spell out you did not hold back your son? Because hold back your son means in your will, right? The Baal Shem Tov always taught that wherever your will is, that's where you are, right? You're not where your body is. You are where your will is. If I'm here, but I want to be somewhere else, I'm somewhere else, right? You know all my stories. I'll tell you the story about the previous Rebbe. You know the stories, right? Previous Rebbe, yes, Steve, all my stories. I'll tell you another story. That once the Rebbe said, there was a Fabrengen, and the Rebbe said l'chaim, and he said l'chaim for the people who are here but are not here, and for the people who are not here but are here. Right? You can be here and not be here, or you cannot be here and be here. It depends where you want to be, right? Like I said, the story is that the previous Rebbe was a kid. He was studying in the study hall, and he was looking outside the window, watching the other kids play. And the teacher said, I'd rather you be outside looking inside than inside looking outside. Right? If you're inside looking outside, means you want to be in the sandbox. Okay, so you're in the sandbox. I'd rather you be in the sandbox. I want to be here. So where are you? That's where your will is. So when he says you did not hold back your son, it doesn't just mean technically you were willing to offer him. It means your will was present. Yes, Steve.
Okay, aside from the Akeda, I'm not asking a question about the Akeda.
Yeah.
But normal sacrifices, suppose there's a blemished animal.
Yeah.
And after a year or so, it heals.
Oh, so now you have a whole discussion. Mum oiver. What happens if it's an animal that has a blemish, but the blemish will heal? Are you allowed to sanctify an animal that now has a blemish? That's a very good Talmudic question, and there's tons of discussion about it. And there's a difference. There's a num kavua. There's a permanent blemish that at that point the animal would never be could not become holy to begin with. If I'm not mistaken, it's Sunday morning. If I'm not mistaken, if you just consecrate an animal that has a blemish, but it will heal. Don't quote me. I'll have to check it out. But I think that the answer is that it could be. The holiness does take place. But it's embarrassing that I can't give you a straight answer because there's so much. This is a big issue. So you identified the issue, and yes, in some cases it would be holy. And that talks about, even if it has a blemish now, what's the definition of a blemish? Is a temporary blemish, philosophically, is that considered a blemish, right? If it's temporary and it could be healed, right? So you can take this discussion to all different directions. But that's certainly a Talmudic discussion. We'll do Vicky and then Steve. Vicky, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi. I had a question about the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, whether he ever addressed the contradiction between his interpretation and Rashi, because if Abraham actually wanted to do the wound in Isaac, and he kind of did it on purpose, so he's not eligible because do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I don't think that there's an actual. Rashi says God senses that Abraham wants to do it. And
right. But if he wants to do it according to Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, and then according to Rashi, he actually had in mind to inflict a wound.
Right.
So
right.
and that contradicts. That would contradict.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that the fact that God says don't make a wound is God is saying your intention was complete. Abraham is afraid that he's not doing enough. So God says, don't slaughter. Okay, but I could do something, right? Abraham is on the worry. Abraham is worried that he's not doing enough. So he has to do something. If God, in other words, remember, from Abraham's perspective, when God says, don't slaughter him, God didn't say it was a test, right? Look at verse 12. And he said, do not stretch out your hand against the land, nor do any against the land. Don't stretch out your hand against the land. If you're Abraham, you don't know that it was a test yet. That doesn't happen till the end of the verse. As far as you're concerned, it's the opposite is true. Abraham, many people think that Abraham then thought that Abraham is worried, maybe God doesn't want Isaac because God thinks that I didn't really want to offer him. Or maybe not just God thinks, maybe subconsciously, I don't really want to offer him. So from Abraham's perspective, when God says don't slaughter him, it's not necessarily a relief. It's not like, oh, relief, it was a test, I passed the test. Maybe I failed the test, right? Maybe God says, okay, you're not the guy I want, right? I asked you to offer your son and you're reluctant, so forget it, right? That's what way to look at it. Sometimes people will give the Rebbe money and he would reject it. He wouldn't take it. And other people he would take from. And the Hasidim thought, if you really want to give, we'll take it. If you don't want to give, we don't want your gift. That's what Abraham's thinking. When God says, I don't need your son, don't do me any favors. I'll give you an example. I tell my child says, oh, can I help? And can I help put away the Passover dishes? Now, I only want them to help if they want to help. If they don't want to help, I don't really want them to help. I don't need someone miserable here helping me. I'd rather do it myself, right? So at some point you say, you know what? Don't help. Go outside and play. Okay? So now they're happy they don't have to play. But from the perspective, if it's a child that wants to help, the child would be like, what? You don't think I really want to do it? The joke. The joke is it's before Passover. It's not a joke, it's a true story. I don't know if it happened, but it's a true story. The joke is that the guy, he's home from work because he took off work. He's going to help his wife prepare for Pesach. So he's in the kitchen running around between getting in her way. So she says, you know something? You want to help? Go to the study hall, go study Talmud. That will be the biggest help. He leaves. Half an hour later, he's back. She says, what happened? She says, how much could you ask me to help already? Right? So the point here is, what I'm trying to say is, when you ask someone for help and you sense that they don't want to help you, you don't want their help. So if you're Abraham and God says, don't stretch your hand against the land. Abraham doesn't know, oh, it was a test, I passed the test. From Abraham's perspective, maybe I don't really want to help. And maybe God says, sorry, we don't need an offering from you. You're really not in the business. You're not in the game. You don't really want to do it. So Abraham says, I really want to do it. I want to show, I'll do something. So God says, don't do anything. So that's Abraham's perspective. If I had to go for Vicky, I would say Rashi and the Medrash are highlighting Abraham's perspective. And the Nesiv of Elazhin is highlighting God's perspective. And God's perspective is the opposite. When God says don't do anything, God is saying, I'm telling you don't do anything because this is the indication that you did it wholeheartedly. So Abraham is worried. Abraham is worried that he didn't do it wholeheartedly. And God is saying, no, you did do it wholeheartedly. And therefore, in halachic language, if I tell you don't make a blemish, what that means is we're dealing here with a holy offering, which means the only way it could be a holy offering is if the will was complete. All I'm trying to say that it's a puzzle. Yeah. So I would say that Rashi, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a beautiful answer. Thank you very much. And also maybe highlights the point that God knows Talmud better than Abraham did.
Yeah, that could be. Steve's going to tell me that Abraham studied the whole Talmud.
Thank you.
It was. But yeah, I think that the perspective of Abraham is worried, and that's why then the angel has to continue and say, I know you're God fearing because Abraham is worried. Go ahead, Steve. You want to ask something?
I always found it very thought-provoking that Abraham knew the Torah.
Right.
He was imbued with Torah.
Right.
So he couldn't have known the end of the story. If he was
Right.
imbued with Torah. So I would surmise that the Torah that he was imbued with was without certain aspects.
Right. I would say Kiyum Abraham. It says that Abraham kept the Torah. Abraham kept the Torah before it was given. So kept the Torah implies either their actual rituals, but even that is problematic because did he eat matzah on Passover? We didn't leave Egypt yet. By the way, the Medrash says they did eat matzah on Passover. The Medrash says that when Isaac was born on Passover, which means the 3 guests that came to Isaac came on Passover, and which means when Abraham tells Sarah when the guests show up and he says, Mahari, quickly go and get 3 lugin of fine flour and make bread. Doesn't say bread, but 3 measurements. What does that remind you of? Seder, Passover night, 3 matzahs, right? So he did certainly kept some ritual. I don't know if all of that maybe means he kept the values, but again, it doesn't necessarily say he knew the whole Torah. He certainly didn't know the stories, but it does say that he kept it. Now, even that you have to define what that means. But yeah, if he knew the end of the story, then there's no story, right? There's no test if he knew the end of the test, right?
So in probability, it alludes to, walking upright.
Yes.
And in God's ways.
Yeah. And also the moral mitzvot. So things that are logically immoral. For example, not necessarily polygamy, but marrying 2 sisters, which Jacob does. So it's a whole discussion in the sages. How could Jacob do it? It's against the Torah. Well, Torah wasn't given. Well, the expectation is that the patriarchs would keep the values of the Torah even before it was given. So how they do that, we have to answer that question. But it's a question, right? So it's not just the abstract value morals, but it's also some. Once those morals play out, if you have the mitzvah that's a logical mitzvah, then the expectation would be that the patriarch should keep it.
So that's 2 sisters if both are living.
At the same time, correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you were married to a woman.
Yeah.
And she was no longer living.
Yes.
And she had a living sister.
Correct.
You could marry her.
Correct. In the lifetime, Torah says it's this week's parsha. It could be. I think it's this week's parsha. I think it's in this week's parsha. So everything is divine providence. Okay, fine. That took 35 minutes. It was meant to take less, but okay. Okay, just a few short points. The big picture point. What is the purpose? We always talk about what's the purpose of the Akedah, what's the purpose of the binding of Isaac, and we say, what's the purpose of the test? God knows the test. God knows Abraham's going to pass the test. So we gave all kinds of interpretations. But I wanted to just offer one more, sort of a modern interpretation. And that is that Abraham is preaching belief in one God, but the main, I don't want to say characteristic because there are no characteristic, but it's an abstract God. You can't see, you can't define, there's no idols, and there's no way of depicting God, because any depiction is a definition, and the only definition is that there are no definitions. Okay. All other, certainly pagan religions, and even some monotheistic religions, have some form, have a symbol. Why do they create symbols? Why? Because that's the natural thing. Naturally, if you want people to connect to something, it has to be tangible. People are not good at connecting to abstract ideas. You can't love something that is undefined. Try to do that. I love the person. I never met them. I don't know how they look. I don't know anything about them. It's impossible to love, right? You cannot create emotional bond, certainly not commitment to something that is undefined. It's very difficult, almost impossible. So therefore, all the pagans and all the philosophers say, you can't just talk about abstract God. Abstract God is not going to get people, it's not going to move people emotionally and create that commitment. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an image. We're going to create something that people could relate to. And of course, Abraham says you defeat the purpose, because the moment you can define it, it's no longer God. So Abraham says, we're going to believe in the abstract God. By the way, some people believe that's one of Abraham's big contributions, helps the common person think abstractly, but that's another discussion. The bottom line is, so what does everyone else laugh at Abraham? Abraham, you have an abstract God. There is no way you're going to be able to create that form of commitment and that form of love and devotion to something that's so abstract. And what does the binding of Isaac prove? That you can. right? So that's sort of the test. We said test is really a banner, the same word, test and banner. You're making the point to everybody. What point are you making? What are you teaching us? What's the takeaway for us? Takeaway is that it's possible to have that great devotion and commitment and love, even if you don't have a physical symbol that you could connect to in a tangible way. So a human being has the capacity to think abstractly, and not only to think abstractly, but also to relate emotionally and to be devoted to something as abstract as the monotheistic God. So that is a big teaching. That's news for us, right? That is actually interesting for us, that we would find surprising that a person has the capacity to do so. And of course, we say it every day in the Torah, Shema Yisrael, V'ahavta, love the Lord your God. Well, how do you love something that's abstract? Okay, so you have to meditate, you have to think, but the bottom line is it's doable. And Abraham is the first one that shows us that it's doable. But if you spoke to people of his contemporaries, they would say, this is a nice idea, but you're never going to be able to get that commitment that other faiths could elicit, because you have nothing tangible. Your God is not as tangible as other gods. So if it's not tangible, people will not be able to relate to it. So that's one angle. I thought that was interesting. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, there's also a question of, can one be commanded to love?
Correct.
And
Correct.
I believe that the Jewish conclusion is that Hashem is the one exception where we can be commanded to love.
Right. So there's
and I think some philosophers, Rosenzweig, for example, interpret loving Hashem is equivalent to loving your neighbor and loving your stranger, loving the stranger.
Yeah. So that's next week's parsha. Very interesting interpretation. The verse says, everyone knows the beginning of the verse. V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha. I'm sorry. V'ahavta l'reacha kamecha. Love your neighbor as yourself. Everyone knows that verse. Reminds me of the other verse that everybody knows. Everyone knows, let my people go. Moshe tells, let my people go. Freedom. But they forget the second half of the verse. Let my people go and serve me in the desert. All right. So Moshe wasn't just looking for liberation. He was looking for liberation that will allow you to serve God. But that's another story. Similarly, next week's parsha, love thy neighbor as thyself. What's the end of the verse? Ani Hashem, I'm the Lord. Everybody says, what does that have to do? So your interpretation actually fits very well, right? Love your neighbor as yourself, I am the Lord. That because your neighbor has as part of God within them, speak in the Hasidic language, but it's the same idea. God is in your neighbor, therefore, love you. In other words, love your neighbor as yourself is an expression of the fact that you love to God. But your other point, your first point is, could there be a commandment to love God? So here the Hasidic movement follows Maimonides, which says that there cannot be a commandment to love, because it's impossible to command love. But it is possible to command, to meditate about matters that would potentially awaken the love. In other words, Maimonides says the commandment is to think about the greatness of God. How do we know the greatness of God? By seeing creation, right? So if you think about the greatness of God as evident by God's creation, then if you meditate properly or long enough, consistent enough, then love will be created. So you can't say love this, love broccoli. No, you can't. But you could say over time, if you meditate of the positive properties of this thing, over time, the love could be developed. And that's something that Maimonides says. And the Maggid of Mezrich, which is the student of the Baal Shem Tov, also said it. And that becomes part of the Hasidic lifestyle, a very important part of the Hasidic lifestyle while there could be no commandment to love, there could be commandment to meditate, which will then, in the language of the Kabbalah, give birth to love. Because in the language of the Kabbalah, Chachma Bina, wisdom and understanding, the intellectual capacities are the parents that give birth to emotion. So everything I love is only because consciously or subconsciously, I find that desirable, right? If I meditate and think about in my awareness. So my awareness, ice cream is good. May or may not be good in reality. Objectively, it may be bad. But if my awareness tells me that it's good, then I'm going to love it. But I could, over time, I could create and shift and manipulate that awareness. And that's how there could be a commandment to love God. So that's Maimonides' answer, I think.
But Rabbi, going back to the idea of Hashem being abstract.
Yeah. Oh, now I was wondering, how did I get here? Thank you. Yes, I had no idea how we got here, but yes.
But I'm probably wrong in saying, but in the beginning, I think Hashem was abstract to Abraham. But then once they were having conversations and Hashem's coming to him and telling him about stone and telling him about, I mean, they were almost,
It's very hard to relate to someone, even if I guess it's easy if someone helps you so you can relate to them, but emotional bond to something that by definition is unknowable. Think about anything you love or anyone you love. You have to relate to the physical, tangible properties.
but to Abraham, he had revealed himself.
Correct, but it's still intangible. So you're right, and you're right. And I guess that Abraham would argue to those people, to his contemporaries, you're underestimating the human spirit. The contrary, what could I be more devoted to? To a tangible piece of gold or to an intangible concept? That meant, I would argue maybe the intangible could elicit more dedication, devotion, because that's transcendent. And I see something greater than myself. And I don't want to devote to something that is smaller than me. I want to devote to something larger than me. So you're right. Of course, you're right. But on the surface, why did people create symbols for God? All the pagans, because they say at least the masses are not able to think abstractly. So you have to have something tangible. Abraham says, no, first of all, rejects that theologically, but maybe even I would argue that if you're Abraham would say what you're saying. Abraham was saying, if it's smaller than, if I know it, then how it limits my devotion. Ultimately, devotion could be something transcendent, greater than me, has to be greater than me, right? Like somebody said, if it's a God, they say, I can't understand what God is doing. So somebody said, if I were God, I would do this. If I were God, I would do that. I can't understand what God is doing. So there's somebody, if it's a God that I can understand, I don't want to serve him. That if it's like, if God is like me, then why do I have to serve him? I'll serve myself. Right. So in some sense, the fact that it's abstract and we're not looking for abstraction. The fact that God is undefined, that allows, once you develop this idea, once you understand, you relate to it, you meditate, then maybe that will allow even more commitments. I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm just saying that this is a revolution in the way people understood religion and the way people understood. If you were speaking to his contemporaries, they would say, what could you possibly expect from people, even if you get them to serve an abstract God, to believe in an abstract God? Let's say you can get that. Let's say you can get to that point where they could actually think abstractly. Could you elicit emotion? Could you elicit dedication and devotion? And they would argue no. Because and Abraham says, no, you're misunderstanding what the abstract God, how in some sense that's actually a way that you could elicit even more devotion, as you're saying. But I think that also Abraham is saying you're underestimating people. You're underestimating the human spirit. So I think that you're right, but you have the advantage of 4,000 years of history on your side. But the first time where people could see that somebody preaching abstractness, abstract God, and yet can have that devotion, that was interesting. That's interesting. That would capture the news. It wouldn't be like on the fourth page of the newspaper on the bottom, right? That would be, oh, that's news. That's interesting. Go ahead, Bob.
Hope you had a wonderful holiday, Rabbi.
Thank you.
So are we regressing then in the Torah? We get a spiritual sense from Abraham, but then we progress to a burning bush, a menorah, 6 parshiot on building a tabernacle, clearly the golden calf, which almost may not be a deviation, maybe yet another further icon in the Bible, or the 5 books. I mean, so what I'm saying is the Torah is flooded with future showings, and we're getting away from spirituality to more tangible ideas.
The short answer is yes, we're regressing. And Maimonides talks about this at great length, talks about the fact how when the Jewish people went to Egypt, because they went to Egypt, and because they were affected by Egyptian culture, the teachings of monotheism were forgotten. And aside for Shevet Levi, aside for the tribe of Levi, they were all serving idols. And we certainly regressed. And Maimonides says the fact that God intervened and sent Moses was really, in some ways, that's how he saved the teachings of Abraham. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why there's a whole mess in the Torah. I don't want to get into it right now because it's a big mess and it's too early in the morning and it's in the weekend and the sun is shining. So I don't want to ruin your day. But there's a big mess in the Torah about the numbers. God tells Abraham his descendants will be enslaved for 400 or foreigners for 400 years. So at the covenant of the parts, it says 430 years. Reality, they were only in Egypt for 210. So what's the idea? There's all kinds of interpretations, but one interpretation is God couldn't wait. Because if God would have waited any longer, if he would wait the original 400 years, Abraham's teachings would be forgotten. So the bottom line is, yes, there's a regression. And God has to send Moses and create the Exodus to save what Abraham planted in the poetic language of Abraham, of the Maimonides. Maimonides is the metaphor of planting the bush, and then there's the weeds come in, and the bush was almost uprooted, and then God has to come and save it. But I would say it's not. You can't just think about it as regression or progression. You have to think about it as 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's the way in the long term of history, the trajectory is positive. But the fact that the Jewish people are running back to the golden calf, and throughout the first temple, they're running back to idol worship continuously, just tells you that the drive, that the desire to have something tangible is real for the human being, and to escape it is difficult, and it's not easy. And certainly in the beginning of our history, now we have practice doing it. But even now, there's a danger where the physical and the ritual take the place of the idea. So this is an ongoing battle. And certainly we regressed because of Egypt, because Egypt was all about the tangible, right? That's why they even their idea of the afterlife was all physical, right? They create the caves for the kings where they put the gold and the silver so they can play with the gold and silver forever. Even their idea of spirituality was all physical. And being in that culture is really a threat to the Abrahamic way of life or philosophy.
And yet the proportionality of the 6 parshiot with the building of the tabernacle, how do you account for that?
So that is a question. The question is the tabernacle, had they not sinned, would there be a tabernacle? And here you have two different interpretations. So one interpretation is that the tabernacle is sort of sort of what's the word I'm looking for? It's sort of a compromise, so to speak. We're going to give you something tangible to look at because the human being has that need. So that's one way to look at it. And some people say there would be no tabernacle if there was no golden calf. Others disagree, and I think it's pretty convincing to say a middle ground. There would be no tabernacle, but there would be a temple in Jerusalem. But the bigger idea is, even in Judaism, when we have symbols like the tabernacle, and when we have something tangible, a place where we go to seek to serve God in Jerusalem, even when we have all the symbols and all the ritual, it's never this is Rabbi Shamshon Fal Hirsch makes this point beautifully. He says it's never a symbol of God. It's always a symbol of what we should become. That's the big difference. That's the big difference. Yes, I need a role model. I need to put a tzaddik and say, I want to be like this guy. Not that guy is God. And the same thing with the temple. What's the menorah? Menorah is not a symbol of God. Menorah is a symbol of the Jewish people, of our calling to add light in the world. And everything in the temple would be not a symbol of God, but a symbol of what we should become. And that's a dramatic difference. And that's important. You have to have if I want to say, you have to have, think about a tzaddik for a second. What's the role of a tzaddik? Judaism has a lot of ideals, but unless I see a role model living those ideals, I would say, well, it's very nice that you're telling me this, but it's impossible to live this way in the real world. So when you see a role model that lives this way in the real world, what do you see? You see, this is what I could become. So this is not an image of God, it's an image of what I could become. And that's a different story. And that we need. And maybe that's a weakness of the human being. Fine, I'm willing to agree. But even the temple, like I said, the temple is not God. It's not a description of God. It's a description of what we should become. And therefore, when we study the portions of a temple, we have it's all. There's also a lot of symbolism. But what is the symbolism? Well, the beams are 10 amot tall. That's the 10 sfirot. That's the 10 soul powers of the human being. In other words, a lot of it is based on what we have to become. So that's what I would say. But your major point is, yes, it's not easy. And it took 1,300 years to be cured from that desire for idols. And it's not just because we wanted to be like the pagans, we wanted to fit into the neighborhood in the Middle East. That too. But it's not only. There is a need. People want things that are tangible, and the ability to relate and certainly devote and create passion and emotion and devotion to an abstract ideal is hard, right? If you want to think contemporary, right? What do we know? We know that until people see things on TV, it makes no difference, right? When people started seeing war on TV, then they become anti-war. Why? Everyone knew abstractly that of the terrible effects of war, but until you see it, until it's tangible, we don't respond the same way, at least on the surface. But Judaism, so in that sense, it seems that Judaism is monotheism is on a disadvantage. But Amy says, and I agree with her, that in the long run, if you're serving something that's tangible, how much devotion could you have to something tangible, right? And something transcendent, then it pays to devote to something transcendent because it's beyond me. So in the short term, it's easier to relate to something tangible. In the long term, I think that if you want true and internal and deeper connection, the transcendent God is not only because that's the truth, but it's actually in some ways probably easier to devote to. So that's what I would say. Steve,
Thank
go
you,
ahead.
Rabbi.
Thank you. Steve, go
Well,
ahead.
everything you say is logical, especially in today's world.
Right.
But however, tangibility, anthropomorphism was not attacked until Rambam
Correct.
in the 13th century.
Correct.
Perhaps earlier by the Karaites.
Correct.
In the 9th century.
Correct.
And so Hashem didn't hide his face until after Job, because Job was the last person where Hashem who communicated with Hashem. So prior to hiding his face and prior to Rambam, tangibility was not an issue.
Correct.
I agree, in today's world and in our lives, what you say makes perfect sense.
So I would say as follows, Steve. I'm not disagreeing with you. I just want to enhance. Why does the Torah speak in human language? Even according to Maimonides. Maimonides says God has no eyes and ears. So it's only a metaphor for God's way of knowing. Okay, so why use these metaphors? Right? What's the answer? The answer is because we relate to it better. And the language of Shamshin Fal Hirsch in the beginning of Noach, it says the Torah is willing to risk using the metaphor. Even though for 1,000 years people maybe took the metaphor a little too literal, the Torah is willing to use this risk, willing to take this risk to convey the message. And the message is that God is not removed, God is involved with the universe. That was a more important message than to protect the purity of the theology, according to Shamshin Fal Hirsch. But all that's proving is that, yes, it's very hard to get to the point. It would take development. I don't think Abraham thought in tangible terms, but the point is that when the Torah is written, the Torah understands the human nature. Even when we know after Maimonides that God is abstract, that God is not defined, the Torah still uses those metaphors and says God's eyes, God's ears, God heard. Why? Because there's some primitive, basic part of us that needs that metaphor. And then we say, relax. The metaphor is just a metaphor. So you have to get from the metaphor and think abstractly. But we still have that metaphor level because it's so hard for us. We're human. It's so hard for us to escape it. And the fact that before Maimonides, many people took it literally, it just proves the point that it's a very difficult leap to make. But even now, even post Maimonides, and Maimonides says, if you believe God has a form, you're a heretic. Other people disagree. But Maimonides believes that. Even after that, the Torah still uses, and the Torah still chose to use human language, because when you tell me God knows and you tell me God's eyes, saying the words God's eyes will make a deeper impression on me. Hopefully I have enough knowledge to understand that it's just a metaphor. And then I have to look for the get rid of the shell and find the nut in the shell. In other words, get rid of the external metaphor and get to the kernel of the idea. But nevertheless, the Torah would just say, God happened to know. No, Torah says God descended to see the city of Sodom. It's got to give us the point. The Torah is risking speaking in tangible language to convey the deeper point, which is God's involvement in the universe. But all this proves is it's not an easy leap to make. And it's certainly not an easy leap to make that God is abstract. And then to create, to serve a God that's abstract, and to be willing to sacrifice your son, not to something as tangible as the sun, and as the tsunami, and as the wind, and as the hurricanes that are obviously intangible and awe-inspiring. But can you create that same level of awe and devotion to something that you cannot see? That people would say, Abraham, you're out of your mind, because you can't make a religion like this. That you're not going to be able to create that devotion that religion demands. And what is the binding of Isaac tells us no, it does. Abraham could, and Abraham shows us that we could have that same devotion. And Amy says even more to the contrary. This is the real devotion, even to the abstract. That's the sign as in the banner. That's the point being made here. Go ahead, Vicky. You have 2 minutes left. Let's see if you can take. Okay, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. I actually had my question before this whole discussion started, and I think you answered a lot of thoughts that I had in mind. Other people had similar thoughts, which proves that we all believe in the same thing, which is a beautiful thing in itself. But my question was about the nature of Abraham's belief. So as we discussed today, so he had some kernel of knowledge of Talmud, right? But also, the most importantly, his belief was not only in God that unifies everything, but even oneness. Oneness includes the spark of God inside him, inside Isaac, inside everybody else.
Right.
And that's why that spark, though not tangible, but tangible enough for him to develop that, sense which is above emotions and probably above Chachma, something like something on the level of surrounding wisdom. And that's probably why we are descendants of Abraham, could develop that understanding in a later.
Yeah, I agree that we are also using, even Maimonides, who says God, talks about how God is intangible. Maimonides himself, if you want to love God, we're using intangible things. Maimonides says, think about nature, think about the beauty of nature. The difference is that we're not saying God is nature. We're saying God is the creator of nature, right? So if you look, in other words, Maimonides is saying, if you want to know the beauty of an artist, look at the work of art. Now, if you walk into the museum and you see the art and say, this is the artist's, then that's foolish, right? But on the other hand, how are you going to appreciate the artists if you have no way of seeing the actions of the artist? So the pagan says that the picture of the wall is God. The Maimonides says, no, God is not the picture. Picture is the creation, but you nevertheless have to look at the creation to be able to extrapolate that the creator has to be greater than this. Right? And the infinity of the universe, the size of the universe, we don't understand anything about the universe. We understand a fraction if we're lucky.
Right, but if you speak about the tangible part of it, maybe we never spoke about Isaac.
That's the key. It's not the tangible part of God. It's a tangible part of the creation of God. And from that we extrapolate. That's the big difference. That is the key difference. The key difference is that like same thing that we mentioned that we discussed with Bob. The temple is not God, it's what we have to become. The world is not God, it is the creation of God. Is nothing but God. It is only an expression of God. All that is true, but it's not God. If I say, well, you have a spark of God, so I'm going to say, well, I may as well pray to you, not to God. That's idol worship, right? So there's a difference between you're in a creation of God, you have a part of God, and then being God. That's all the difference.
And I think that's what they shared, both Abraham and Isaac, and that's why it allowed for the whole thing to happen.
I think you're right. Okay, so I guess we were successful in that we discussed very important points. We were unsuccessful in the fact that we could not read more than 3 verses in the verse. But that's the trade-off. Okay, so God willing, we'll meet again next week, and then we should continue. And God will just give us a long life, and then we'll be able to finish the whole Torah on our pace. We may have to need a few decades, but okay.
Rabbi, I just have a quick sort of halachic question. And it's not for the group, but it may be interesting to the group, but so we're cleaning our house out and purging things because we're moving to a much smaller place. And I found all of these old shofars, that the kids brought home from Hebrew school. What is the proper way to deal with those? Because the ram's horns.
Yeah, so shofar is one of those things that it's not actual holiness, it's used for holiness. So there's a distinction between something that's holy, like a mezuzah or a tefillin or a talis, or well, not talis, but something that's actually holy, and something that's used for holy. So something that's used for holiness is not on that same level, and therefore doesn't have to be buried, for example. You don't want to discard it in a way that's not respectful. So we can talk about it, but we talk about the practicalities off the call, text me or whatever, call me. But the general idea is that there's a distinction between a holy object, like the Word of God, like a Bible, like a Torah, and something that is used for a mitzvah. Like my one of the children wanted to know yesterday if the matzah, if you can throw out matzah after Passover. So I don't know why you would want to do that. It costs so much. No, I'm kidding. It's shmura matzah. But matzah is not holy. You use it for a holy on Passover, but so there's a distinction over there.
Do you have a minute? I have another question related to that to ask you. When can I call you or speak to you?
Okay, call me in a few minutes. That's fine.
Okay, perfect. I have another question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Be well, everybody. Have a wonderful day.